I'm Sonya Morton-Firth, and you're tuned in to the Sonya Morton-Firth Show. Today, my guest is Dr. Simon Ruffell, psychiatrist and specialist in ayahuasca. Join us in this conversation where spirituality meets science as we go deep into the plant-based medicine ayahuasca. This will be mind-blowing. Simon, welcome to my show. It's lovely having you here. Now, you're not in the Amazon jungle, but where are you? Welcome, Simon.
Thanks so much. No, I'm really glad to be here. I know I'm not in the Amazon jungle. I'm in the concrete jungle of London, which is where I'm based in between trips to the Amazon jungle. So yeah, you call me at a good time. The signal's not too good in the jungle.
Well, Simon, I have wanted to delve deeper into the world of plant-based medicine for quite some time. I became fascinated with it a couple of years ago when I interviewed Keith Abraham, a veteran who had done a lot of work around trauma and the effects that ayahuasca has particularly with veterans. And that led me off onto my own journey, and having recently experienced the wonders of ayahuasca, I knew I wanted to get an expert onto my podcast. So Simon, before we delve deeper, could you give my audience some background on who you are and what led you to this path today?
Yeah, sure. It's a bit of a peculiar story, but I just can tell it to you how it happened. So I'm a medical doctor by background. I used to work in general medicine, and then I specialized in psychiatry. And so I worked as a psychiatrist for a few years. I did that around the UK. But after a few years of working in psychiatry, I was getting pretty dismayed by a lot of the ways that we were treating our patients, and specifically the drug treatments. And mainly just because I didn't really feel that patients were getting the treatment that they needed. And I'm not anti-medication. I think that there is definitely a role for medication. But I just think that we use it, we overuse it, rather than treating the root cause of these problems. So I was on a little bit of a mission to try and find something better, but didn't really have much of a plan. And my mission just largely involved just floating around for a couple of years. And I ended up working in Uganda for a bit, which was super interesting, working with child soldiers. And then I ended up in Central America, and I actually happened by a stroke of luck or fate, depending on which way you want to look at it, sitting next to a shaman who was on holiday in Guatemala in a cafe. And as you do, and started speaking to him about the work that he was doing. And he was working with ayahuasca. And at this point, I'd never drunk ayahuasca. I definitely had no idea that I was going to start researching in it, and later actually start training in Shipibo shamanism myself, which I've now been doing for 5 years. And so I traveled down to the Amazon rainforest with this man. I had my first experience drinking ayahuasca in the jungle. And needless to say, I can see your face. You know what it's like. I had a similar experience to you. My mind was just blown. And so when I left the jungle and I eventually came back to the UK, I started looking into the research that had been done into ayahuasca. And I found that some early stage research did exist, which was largely largely Brazilian researchers, and they were doing some early stage research in labs and also in some of these ayahuasca churches throughout Brazil. So you have these churches that amazingly combine Christianity with ayahuasca, and they're quite common throughout Brazil. But there was pretty much no scientific research in the Amazon rainforest into ayahuasca. So I called some colleagues and floated the idea that we could research ayahuasca. Fortunately, they were keen, and so we started our first study in 2016, looking at the effects of ayahuasca on personality. And to be honest, I thought that would be it. That would be the one time that I researched ayahuasca, and, that was interesting. But from then, everything snowballed, and we ended up, that study got a fair amount of attention. We ended up getting funding from the UK government, expanded our studies, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. I did a PhD into Amazonian ayahuasca and mental health. We formed a research not-for-profit called Onaya Science. It became my full-time job, and now we have a team of about 13 researchers working with us in our research and retreat center in the jungle. And so, yeah, that is how it happened. That's my life in the last
Whoa.
10 years in 5 minutes.
That is quite a background, definitely. So literally, I mean, I wanted to go back to God, you said child soldiers. That in itself must have been
Mm,
quite an ordeal from that and then into to the Amazon.
mm,
Did
mm,
you was there anything that you brought from sort of your prior life? I want to say before taking ayahuasca, um, to
mm.
after that stage.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting when you mention the kind of the working with the child soldiers, because obviously working with child soldiers, you're working with a lot of trauma. And there are a few things there now that I reflect on it. You know, the doses of medications they were using were very, very high. Maybe that was a motivation to start looking into different ways of treating mental health problems. But actually, interestingly, when I was in Uganda, I was in northern Uganda in a town called Gulu, and I that was actually my first experience of working with traditional healers. So they're called kind of quote unquote witch doctors. It's an insult, really. We shouldn't really say that, but that's what people how they refer to them in Uganda. And I was working with some of these witch doctors and trying to set up a referral system so that they would refer patients that they were seeing to the psychiatric ward that I was working on. And the way that I set it up was that I would teach them about Western mental health. And then in exchange, they would teach us about the work that they were doing. And when they started teaching us about the work that they were doing, I was just completely fascinated, way more fascinated than I thought I would be, and just couldn't honestly couldn't get enough. And I made really strong friendships with a lot of these traditional healers, and was just fascinated. And so I think I was already slightly primed by the time I met who the man who later became my teacher in Guatemala. I was ready to go and kind of like a sponge, ready to absorb different ways of thinking about the universe and ultimately treating mental health problems.
Wow. Okay, let's take it back a little bit to basics because I'm aware that some people might know what ayahuasca is, or could you describe what it actually is, and how you take it, or how one would typically take it?
Yeah, sure. So ayahuasca, very simply put, is a traditional medicine that's used by many indigenous communities throughout South America. And it's a potent psychedelic brew. So it contains the incredibly strong psychedelic substance, dimethyltryptamine or DMT, as well as some other chemicals that's mixed in that brew. And then when you drink it, you usually have it in some kind of a ceremonial setting. And it's believed that it allows you to enter the world of the spirits, and this is where you can achieve healing by traditional healers. And then, according to Western scientists, it contains various different chemicals that affect receptors in your brain, such as the serotonin receptor, and changes the connectivity between different brain regions. And those things are thought to have a positive therapeutic effect as well. So there are different lenses in which you can view how it's working, depending on which paradigm you resonate with.
And this must go back for years and years and years. How was it traditionally used, by
Mm.
the indigenous populations? If you take out before us Westerners went there and used it for different things, do you know about the traditional way it was used?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually a really interesting point, and it's something that people don't talk about that much. So traditionally, ayahuasca is seen as a vehicle that takes you into the spirit world. And then when you're in the spirit world, you can use it for a wide range of things. And you can use it for healing, and then you can use it for divination, which is to look into the future. This is what the indigenous people say. But then there's this whole other side of ayahuasca, which doesn't fit into the Western perception of what ayahuasca is. So in the New Age movement, where people are drinking lots of ayahuasca, and there's kind of modern day hippies, everyone's like, oh, it's all about love and light and healing, which it is. It's an incredibly powerful medicine for healing. But there's this whole other side of it, which is used in the Amazon rainforest for witchcraft. It's called brujeria. And then also for hunting and various other purposes. So we see that the actual tradition of using ayahuasca, at least in the jungle, is changing with the influx of what's known as ayahuasca tourists into South America, into the jungle. Shamans are realizing that the money is in the healing, because Westerners don't want, most of the time, and don't want to be engaged in witchcraft, and it doesn't fit their perception of what ayahuasca should be like. So traditionally, I had a bit of a different use, and it's slightly changing, which is, yeah, is it good? Is it bad? Nobody
Well,
else.
that's quite phenomenal. Given sort of, I guess the experience I had was certainly there was I didn't have any dark. There wasn't a dark side to it. I very much felt the love and the connection, and just immense feelings of gratitude. It's. Do you think we've taken this in terms of the Western world and we're commercializing it too much? I mean, you've only got to like search on YouTube, and there's been various different documentaries by big YouTubers and other people that have gone into the jungle, and they've had various different ceremonies, and they've documented that. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I actually think a lot of it is very good things. So actually, people are trying to do something to better themselves. That's how I see it. But do you think there's a danger around this?
Yeah, I think there's a massive danger to do with the commodification of indigenous practices. And that makes it all the more important that we're working in partnership with indigenous peoples in reciprocal relationship with genuine benefit sharing. But then it's interesting when we speak to, so I work with an indigenous tribe called the Shipibo people, based in the jungle in Peru. And even within the Shipibo, there's a massive range of opinions as to how ayahuasca should be used. So it's not uniform. So the teacher that I work with, Don Rono, he believes that his mission in life, along with his two brothers, who are these fantastic curanderos or traditional healers, they believe that their role in life is to spread ayahuasca, because ayahuasca, they believe, is a conscious being that has a plan to help humanity. So that's what they feel, and so that's why they're keen to train people like myself and then other Westerners who can run ceremonies in different parts of the world. So they see it almost as a little bit like sending out the white blood cells kind of across the world, across humanity. But then you have other Shipibo shamans who go as far to say that only Shipibo people should drink ayahuasca. And if you're not indigenous, you shouldn't be allowed to drink ayahuasca. So there's this whole spectrum of different opinions on who should be and who shouldn't be allowed to drink ayahuasca. But I think, we need to be realistic in terms of what's happening. And ayahuasca has spread. It's too late if you were planning on keeping it a secret or not having it spreading around the world. I mean, you've already missed the boat about 10 years ago. So I think the question now becomes, how do we work with these plants in an ethical way to include indigenous healers at every stage of when it comes to research, of a research process, to involve them in that, to have this genuine benefit sharing, and to treat these plants with respect. And I think that there is a way to do it where it's of benefit to everyone, including ourselves and nature and the whole world at large. But it's a minefield, especially as we approach the potential medicalisation of a lot of these plants that are deemed incredibly sacred to many people.
I mean, it would be such a shame when you say medicalization of it. It'd be such a shame to take away the whole ceremony, which when I entered into it, and I did it a few weeks ago, I wasn't really aware of everything that was involved. Before, because you have a whole diet regime as well before. And when I say diet, it's not like a typical diet that you go on here. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that and why there is such a sort of diet, but also the sort of spiritual journey you undertake beforehand. And that could be anything from meditation to journaling to just being mindful and to setting your intentions. And then the ceremony around it, which I'd love to get into. it all makes part of it, your
Mm.
experience. And it would be such a shame to sort of, okay, take the science and take the medical applications without incorporating that ceremony. How do you feel about that, Simon? And can you
Yeah,
explain a
absolutely.
little bit more about the sort of ceremonial type side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with looking at the chemicals that make up ayahuasca in a lab and doing clinical trials on that. I'm actually involved in some of that stuff. But the important thing to mention there is that that's not ayahuasca. That's something else. That's just chemicals. That's just, a DMT hormonal alkaloid combination, which are the chemicals which are in the ayahuasca brew. What makes ayahuasca is the ceremony, is the ceremonial setting, is the container. Like that's what ayahuasca is. And the ceremony is everything, and there's this stark contrast between the way in which the Shipibo shamans explain what's happening in the treatment of their participants when compared to the Western medical model. So, from a Western perspective, the chemicals in ayahuasca interact with the receptors in the brain, such as the serotonin receptor, and they're changing the connectivity between different brain regions. But from the perspective of the Shipibo, the healing is put down to the communication with spirits in the ceremony. Almost all of the healing is put down to that. In fact, the Shipibo shamans don't even insist that you drink ayahuasca when you attend ceremonies. You just have to be in the ceremony to allow them to do their healing through these so-called communications with spirits. So I can't emphasize how important the ceremony is, and that's why in our research in the jungle we only look at ceremonial use of ayahuasca. So the research that we do in the jungle is called observational research, as opposed to controlled research, which is lab-based research. And so sometimes, whenever we whenever we publish papers, you have to go through this review process, and you have other researchers who review your papers, and they kind of critique it, and then you change it, and then you publish it. And the one of the main critiques that we always get is, if you're not doing this research in a lab, how do you know that it's not the effect of the ceremony, or it's not the effect of the jungle? How do you know it's not just the chemicals? And my response always is, well, that's the whole point. I'm not trying to separate the chemicals from the ceremony, because that's what makes ayahuasca. That is ayahuasca. Otherwise, you just have a really reductionistic way of looking at what ayahuasca is.
Do you find it difficult to explain to people that haven't actually experienced ayahuasca, when, to sort of talk through the scientific reasoning behind, why these benefits when they haven't actually taken it? Because to a lot of people, maybe that aren't really interested, that maybe just think of it and I hate to say this, another drug, which
Yeah.
oh, there must be dangers around it. Oh, does it do something to your mind? And it's mind altering. And all the sort of the fallacies that we had dictated to us back in, before I was born, but certainly in the 60s, when it just sort of it was squashed, because we were all people were opening their minds up to
Mm,
the
mm.
possibilities of life, and it was sort of squashed by the American government.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one of the beautiful things about ayahuasca is that you can look at it from many different lenses, and so you can really meet people where they're at. And so, yeah, I was based at King's College London for years, and if I spoke the way that I'm speaking to you now on this podcast about spiritual, people's spiritual beliefs and the beliefs of indigenous peoples, I'd be laughed out the door. And so the way that I presented the work that I did was to, show graphs that showed decreases in depression, decreases in anxiety, changes in the expression of our DNA, and then also shown that when we analyzed ayahuasca, it contained DMT, which is a serotonin agonist, so it had an effect on these receptors, which were likely causing that effect. It's not disingenuous, but it's not the whole picture. It's just one way of looking at it that allows people to understand. And I find that a lot of the research that we do in the jungle is more like translation rather than anything else. We're translating what these indigenous people are saying into a language that a Western audience can understand.
Wow. So let's go back to the south. Let's take people through a little bit of an experience about talking through. So it starts weeks before, really. with the dieta, as they call it, or the diet. Why do we have to, or why, I get why, you can't drink alcohol, you shouldn't be on medication. That sort of made sense to me. But then there were all these other rules about certain foods, red meats. I mean,
Mm.
sauerkraut, I thought that was super healthy. You weren't
Yeah.
not allowed to eat fermented foods beforehand. Tell me a little bit about that. And
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there are two ways of looking at why the diet's important. So, firstly, the ayahuasca diet and for the preparation, like preparing for ayahuasca and afterwards, that's a Western thing. That's not a traditional thing. In the jungle, there's no such thing as this ayahuasca diet. It's mainly because us Westerners eat a load of random stuff that isn't really food. So they're trying to flush all of this processed food, all these medicines, all these chemicals out of our system because they can, well, one way of looking at it, which is very true, is that there can be interactions with the chemicals in ayahuasca with a lot of these medications and a lot of these foods. So, for example, it's important to come off medications like antidepressants because they can increase a chemical in your brain called serotonin. And also, the chemicals DMT and monoamine oxidase inhibitors in ayahuasca can also increase the same chemical. So you can end up with a potentially fatal reaction called serotonin syndrome. So that's a very medical way of why it's important to follow that diet. But then there's also the spiritual reasons behind the importance of the ayahuasca diet. So, for example, you were probably told, you mentioned the red meat. One of the main things that you can't eat is pork.
mm,
And everyone always emphasizes pork and also no sex. Like there's no physiological reason why sex or pork would interact with ayahuasca. There's no reason, but it's energetic, it's spiritual. So the shamans say, especially with pork, that the energy of pork clashes with the energy of the plant spirits, and that when you eat pork, it's it just doesn't work, and it's a real issue for the shaman in the ceremony. And then they have to spend hours cleaning the pork energy out from the ceremony before they can start working. So it's this thing, and I've been in many ceremonies where shamans been like, oh yeah, for God's sake, like whatever, like John must have eaten pork, and it took me ages to clean it, and it told him not to, and he's denying it, but like he definitely did, and there are these, all of these kind of instances. And the same with sex, you're not supposed to have sex on a retreat. And I've been in ceremony multiple times and I've been like, oh, for God's sake, two of the participants have been having sex. It's like, really? Did they tell you? It's like, no, but it took me ages to clean in ceremony this evening. So there are these other experiences, these other reasons behind these strict rules. But yeah, once again, it's fascinating. You can look at it from these different angles, and there are times that you can explain it from a Western lens, and there are times that you just have to take your Western medical hat off and start putting on your Shipibo shamanism hat and explain the world through that paradigm.
I was super worried that I was going to be. I mean, you hear horror stories about people throwing up, shitting themselves, doing all of these things. So I was like, right, I'm going to stick to this diet religiously just in case anything happens. And I don't know if that's related, or I believe purging is not just about necessarily the diet, but about the trauma that's coming up.
Yeah, so the purging is a huge thing, and actually ayahuasca is even called la purga in many different traditions
Mm.
because it's seen as a very therapeutic effect. It's releasing negative energy. It's just a big release of energy. That's how it's seen. But then also again, it's because there's a lot of serotonin within ayahuasca, or it releases a lot of serotonin in the body. There's a lot of serotonin in the gut, and when you have this increase in serotonin, you just vomit. So again, there are different ways of looking at it, but it's another reason that when we think about the potential medicalization of psychedelics, there's this clash in paradigms, this paradigmal clash. And so I'm doing these trials. I used to work on the psilocybin trials at King's, and then some more at the Psych Institute at the University of Melbourne. And the purge is written down as an adverse effect. You have to log it as an adverse effect, seen as a negative thing. But in a traditional way of working with psychedelics, that's a super good thing. In the Santa Daime Church in Brazil, they refer to it as getting well. You're releasing this negative energy. And then here, we're damning it into the adverse reactions working clinical trials. And so, yeah, another way when these paradigms don't quite fit together.
It's super interesting, isn't it? How two sort of worlds look at different things, and one can be good
Mhm.
and one can be bad. So okay, so we've got the diet. We're at the ceremony. How does the next stage work? Walk us through the sort of the typical ceremony.
Sure. I mean, it really depends on the tradition that you're drinking ayahuasca with, because the ceremonies do differ. But in the Shipibo tradition, which is a very common tradition, and a lot of different New Age ayahuasca ceremonies take inspiration from it. The ceremony would normally start after dark, after night. And the Shipibo say that's because when the plants become awake. And interestingly, that is also the case in a lot of traditional medicine across the East as well. So, like in Eastern traditions, people say that, don't disturb the plants at night. That's when they become awake. And from a scientific perspective, that's also when a lot of the biological processes within plants are happening. So it's interesting that it happens at night. So then everybody would drink the brew, including the people who are holding the ceremony, which is another kind of stark difference from therapy or psychedelic therapy in the West. And then when the effects, the psychedelic effects of the brew of ayahuasca start to hit you, and you start to become kind of high and experience and visions for many people, then there would normally be some form of music. So you were talking earlier about Icaros, that's the traditional shamanic chanting of the Shipibo. But some people, it depends where you go. In other areas of Peru, there's some people playing guitar, and it can be a lot happier. Shipibo is normally quite dark. It's kind of like they call them the spiritual surgeons. It's this gnarly, dark
Okay.
underground of removing negative energies. But then you also get some ceremonies that are more like a celebration. You might even have a fire in the center of what's going on. And it normally lasts for about 6 hours. There's normally quite a lot of purging, and the purging can come in many different forms. So you can have the physical vomiting that we were talking about. But then you can also purge just by kind of screaming or shouting or laughing or crying or shaking or sweating. All of these things are seen as an energetic release. And you can let go of emotion, let go of energy through that way. And then normally at the end of about the 6 hours, you're in what's called the ayahuasca afterglow state, which lasts for about 48 hours, when physiologically your brain is far more malleable and far more impressionable, kind of like when you're in a childlike state. It's much easier to learn stuff, and you're in this vulnerable state, this sensitive state, this beautiful state for about 48 hours, and then you start your integration process.
Wow. I mean, I didn't actually purge in the ceremony that I did. In fact, I didn't actually move my body at all. I went on a great. I traveled. I traveled space and time. People listening to this might think this I'm absolutely crackers, but it was my reality. I absolutely saw some beautiful things and just felt an immense amount of love and connection. And yeah, the fact that we're all one, it was almost like I was being given these amazing, I'm going to say answers of the universe, and it's not 42 if anyone's seen Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe. But yeah, it was absolutely amazing. And, I wrote pages in a journal afterwards.
Mm.
Um, but everybody, and I was in a group, had very different experiences. Everybody's journey was completely different.
Yeah, I am.
And as I understand it, because I only did one ceremony, but typically in the jungle, you would do sort of back to back ceremonies, maybe one day followed by another, followed by another. Is there a reason, or what is the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, you're right. So in the jungle, you would normally go on a retreat, and that would be anywhere from, I don't know, the shortest I've seen is about a week, and the longest I've seen is normally a month, 2 months. Um, yeah, and you would normally be drinking ayahuasca 3 times a week. That's normally the setup on one of these retreats. And you're right, you do go deeper in general. The more that you drink ayahuasca in a short space of time, you go deeper and deeper and deeper. Also, interestingly, the shamans say the first half of the retreat is normally cleaning, so you're removing out all of your kind of your negative energy, all of your traumas, all of those kind of things. And then the second half, you're being filled up with light. That's normally the process of the ceremonies. of the retreats. But of course, the retreat structure again isn't an indigenous thing. That's a Western thing. It's kind of bizarre, when you compare it to what would that look like if we flip the cultures around, and it would look like an indigenous person, coming over to London, going to a hospital and being like, this is great, I'm going to get all the MRIs, I'm going to take all the antibiotics, going to have a CT scan, I'm going to have like 3 enemas, I'm going to get everything that I need all in one go. And you wouldn't really do that if you lived in the jungle. Like in my experience, the indigenous peoples who aren't shamans, who are just living in the jungle, going to an ayahuasca ceremony is something that they only do when they really have to. And it's a little bit like going to the dentist. They're like, oh God, I'm going to have to go and see a curandero. And I really don't want to, but I've got this energetic blockage that I have to get rid of, or I've got this, sickness or this illness, and the curandero will know how to treat it. And so they go when they have to. So it's a bit of a Western thing, unless, of course, you're training in shamanism. The retreat structure is a Western thing.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk about your findings and
Mm.
some of your research, because you've already said that you've looked at it in terms of trauma, but what it does in terms of personality, you mentioned.
Mm.
Can you talk a little bit around, well, firstly, let's talk about trauma, because that's how I got introduced to it. And when I first interviewed Keith, one of the veterans that I had on my show, and he does a lot of work with Heroic Heart. So I believe the UK charity that I believe
Yeah.
you're involved with as well. And that's how we know each other.
Yeah, for sure. So our most recent studies have been with military veterans suffering from PTSD, and then they're traveling to the Amazon rainforest to try and treat the traumas that they've been through. And so we're investigating them on a number of different levels. So we're looking at their epigenetic change. So epigenetics is looking at how the expression of genes change as a result of the environment that we're in, rather than changing the DNA itself.
Are you familiar with Dr. Bruce Lipton and his work? Yeah.
No,
I
I
saw
am.
him in London brilliant, a couple of years ago.
Nice.
He's coming again this year, so
Oh, awesome.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
I have to look that up and get some
yeah.
tickets. Yeah, so so with epigenetics, when you're looking to see whether things like the environment, like nutrition or air quality, affect the expression of our genes, that's how epigenetics normally affects us. But obviously, if we have a big trauma, then that affects the expression of genes in a massive way. And so we're specifically looking to see whether or not genes associated with trauma change their expression as a result of ayahuasca, and to see whether ayahuasca can change the expression of genes that have been dysregulated because of war. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. And epigenetics is fascinating as well, because recent research suggests that epigenetic change can be passed down through generations. So, for example, the children of Holocaust survivors being more susceptible to stress. So, and then there's this whole really interesting area where it seems to map on to something that the shamans are saying. So the shamans talk about cleaning familial lines, which is the way that familial traumas, get passed down through generations. And it seems like we could be talking about the same thing. So maybe the negative energies that the shamans are describing could be manifesting on a genetic level, and then ayahuasca could be specifically implementing change there. Who knows? That's one way that they could be mapping onto each other.
And so
Yeah,
ayahuasca can help change the sort of the trauma or the epigenetics around the traumatic cells.
exactly. I mean, we're looking to see whether or not it can change that dysregulation. So if you've experienced a major trauma, then it might be that you've changed the regulation of a gene that's associated with something. So, for example, cortisol would be as a stress hormone. And so it may be beneficial in a war situation to have, you know, cranked up the gene related to cortisol so that you're ready to go in your fight or flight. But then when you're back in civilian life, that's completely inappropriate, because if you have a super, you know, you're reactive in terms of cortisol, and you're just in the supermarket and somebody drops a trolley, then you don't want to be prepared. Exactly. Yeah, you
I'm
don't.
from Newcastle, so we do that anyway.
Right. Okay. Yeah. This could also help people from Newcastle. So yeah, it's looking whether it can kind of reverse that change in expression back down to how it was before. That's the kind of the working theory.
And in terms of personality, I thought I found this very interesting. So if we're stepping away from sort of the trauma aspects, just in terms of people's personality and what it does to the actual brain as well, I found that
Mhm.
fascinating.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So yeah, this was our first ever study. We were looking at the effects of ayahuasca on personality. And we found that it decreased how neurotic people were immediately after their retreats, and that stayed 6 months later. And then it also interestingly increased how agreeable they were immediately following and 6 months later as well. So, yeah, some interesting findings there. We also, so with the way that we measure personality is we break it down into 5 segments. So, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is referred to as the big five. It's a common way of looking at personality. And
And
we
that
found,
would go for anybody, you would sort of class them in those sort
yeah,
of
yeah,
areas.
yeah.
Okay.
So that's a common way of looking at it. Businesses quite often assess people's personality based on that breakdown, and then they can use these personality measures and inventories to try and find people that would fit the jobs that they're looking for. So it's quite a common way of looking at personality. Um, Yeah, unsurprisingly, we found that the people who had actually traveled to the jungle to drink ayahuasca were already maxing out on openness, so there wasn't much of an increase there because they couldn't really go much higher. But
Yeah.
I imagine that it would probably increase openness as well if they weren't already super open.
Yeah, I guess that is a big trait. You have to be, well, the very fact that you're taking ayahuasca means yeah, you're an open person. Not
Yeah.
necessarily open in everything, but at least you're willing to, yes, be open to the effects of it. Oh,
Mhm.
interesting. And the microbiome is the other, because we're all
Mhm.
talking about the microbiome, and another sort of fascination of mine is I'm very much into biohacking and finding out how we can get more from the human body, the vessel that we've been given. And obviously that definitely came out in my experience with ayahuasca. We are not our bodies. These are beautiful vessels we've been given. So yeah, what sort of results or what sort of findings did you have on what happens with the microbiome?
Yeah, so that is a new part of the study that we haven't analyzed the data of yet. But the working hypothesis is that when you re-establish a healthy mix of gut microbes, then it's going to improve conditions like depression and trauma. And I mean, all the all the purging, all the diarrhea, everything that happens within the ayahuasca experience, there's going to be some change to the gut microbiome there. Like there definitely will be. So it's just assessing whether or not that change is also beneficial for mental health outcomes. My hypothesis is that it will be, is that it will somehow be improving it because ayahuasca seems to be having a really beneficial effect on mental health for most people. So I think it probably will be somehow.
And do these effects last with a period of time? A lot of these people go back to their to the Western world, I guess, get on with their jobs, doing whatever they do. Is it something that you've sort of looked at in the future or looked at when they've come back?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. So with our research so far, the longest follow-up that we've done is 6 months. And the 6 month follow up, at 6 months, people are normally still much better than they were when they drank ayahuasca, but they're beginning to go back to their baseline. So they're beginning to return to where they were. And then just, when we speak to people just face to face and say, how are you getting on? Because we keep in contact with, most of the participants. Most of them say, I just really feel like I need a top up. I'm still doing good, but I just feel like I just need to top up and bring myself back to where I was before. So that's interesting. And with the work with the veterans, so in these later studies where we're looking at epigenetics, the gut microbiome, also looking at neuroimaging, which is EEG, and then the response to and then PTSD symptoms, how they change, and also cognitive, like cognition, how cognitive flexibility and things like that. For that study, it's an ongoing study over 5 years, and we're going to be following people up for at least a year. So it should help us to get a better idea about how long these changes last for.
Wow. Um, it's It's fascinating where this could go. Where do you sort of see this going? What's your vision for the future in terms of where you want to see your research, being led?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two different paths that ayahuasca could take. And one of them we kind of touched on before, which is integrating ayahuasca or attempting to integrate something reminiscent of ayahuasca into the medical model. So we might see that there are that there are clinics that can work with things similar to ayahuasca. It arguably wouldn't be ayahuasca. And then that's kind of used in a psychotherapeutic setting. So we have psychedelic assisted psychotherapy using something that's similar to ayahuasca in hospitals. That's one way they could go. The other way, which I think would probably be more effective, would be to have clinics or retreat center style things around the jungle, but then also around the rest of the world that are using ayahuasca in a ceremonial setting and being open and true to the traditions, working with indigenous peoples, um, and have their own board of regulations, kind of similar to acupuncture. So acupuncture isn't really used in hospitals. It's not really used on the NHS, but there's a whole regulation board. There's evidence supporting its use, and it's done in a professional way with very good results. And I wonder if there's another way that we might see ayahuasca being used that's more similar to that.
Would we take away the spiritual side of it and the ceremonic side of it by regulating it?
I don't think so. I think that there are definitely issues to do with regulation, because who gets to decide what the standard for ayahuasca is? There are so many different ways of working with ayahuasca, and if it's not indigenous peoples who are making that decision, then that's going to be problematic. But then even enforcing the idea of regulation onto indigenous peoples is problematic in already, because they don't do that. A lot of it's by word of mouth, and regulatory bodies are very much a Western thing. So we're going to have to be very careful in the way that we think about regulation. But at the same time, I think that you could totally have a standard based on what a spiritual practice should look like. And that could be done through word of mouth. And I don't think it would take away the spiritual component. It would almost just be adapting these practices for a Western setting. Because at the moment, one of the issues that we have with shamanism and with spirituality is that there aren't the same regulatory practices that we have in Western medicine. So in Western medicine, for me, it was 6 years of medical school, and then you're a doctor, and then it's like another 6 years to be a psychiatrist, and then so where people are, what grade they're at. But with shamanism, you don't have that. You could be working with someone for 10 years and still not be any good. And there are some people who've just done a few years and they're suddenly incredibly good. But on the whole, it's a similar length of time. It's about 5 years until you're kind of roughly a baseline level of shaman in the jungle. And then another kind of 5 years until you're kind of more expert and you start having apprentices and stuff like that. So I think that we could have some rough way of regulating it, but it's going to take a lot of difficult conversations with indigenous people to figure out how to do that effectively.
Simon, are you led by, I want to say led by the grandmother? People call ayahuasca the grandmother. That's what, I don't know if you've heard, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard of it.
Have you been led by her
Mm, mm.
in terms
I
of
mean,
your work and your vision for what you're doing?
yeah, for sure. I mean, that's an interesting question. And again, okay, I'm going to give you an example, because there are different ways that you can think about this. So after I'd been conducting research in the jungle for about 5 years on and off, I started getting messages, if you want to call it for a better sense of words. I started repeatedly hearing in ceremony, you should do a PhD into ayahuasca, you should do a PhD into ayahuasca. And every time I drank ayahuasca, I would just hear this, and I'd be sitting on my mat saying, no, that's like the last thing I want to do. Like going to med school was enough. I never want to do anything like that again. I definitely don't want to do that. And then, but that message just kept coming back time and time again. Like whenever I drank ayahuasca, until eventually I started looking into PhDs, and then got accepted onto one very specific one that allowed me to do what I wanted to do. And yeah, it was this incredibly fluky path, and I ended up doing that PhD. So when I tell that story, for a lot of people, you could interpret that as, yeah, Simon was totally led by ayahuasca to do a PhD into ayahuasca. But then there's this whole other side of it, which I don't think is necessarily separate. And it depends what your perception of reality and consciousness is. But, you know, did I want to do a PhD deep down? Did I know that it would have been beneficial for my career? Was that in my subconscious? And it could have been coming up to the surface because I knew that I didn't want to work in mainstream psychiatry. And so the best way to move forward would be to have an academic career in research with ayahuasca. Both of those are true. Both of them are true. That could have been in my brain and probably was somewhere. And then I also got the messages in ceremony. And I think it makes sense to perceive it like that. There's this quote, it's all in your head. You just have no idea how big your head is, which I just absolutely love. And I think that sums up my experiences with ayahuasca. It's both of them. It's me and ayahuasca. It's 100% me and 100% ayahuasca. It's just up to you to decide what ayahuasca is.
Wow, that leads nicely on to do you describe yourself or how you think of yourself as a scientist or spiritual?
I think, well, in my experience of working in the scientific world, everyone's perception is like, whoa, okay, that's super spiritual, and it's kind of leaning to the outskirts of science. But then whenever I'm in the spiritual world, everyone's like, oh yes, that scientist guy who's, and the shamans, the curanderos I work with are always laughing at me for trying to force our research into, or the ayahuasca experience into a scientific way. And it's like, yeah, by all means, like try and do that. That's absolutely fine. But you're ignoring the spiritual components, and I'm trying to kind of squeeze it in together. So I think I probably sit somewhere firmly in the middle between the two.
Where science meets spirituality. I
Exactly.
love that. There's
Exactly.
the title
That's
for our
psychiatry.
podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. There we go.
Simon, tell me about your work, where your where people can find out more about your work and you, and how people can help if they would like to help.
Yeah, that'd be great. So we run a research not-for-profit called Onaya Science, which is ONAYA.science is our website. And we rely entirely on donations. So if anybody is interested in donating, please do get in touch. And that would be really, really appreciated. We've also just set up a new organization just called Onaya, which is onaya.io. And we're running courses for preparation and integration that combine science and spirituality. So we've designed them with the Shipibo shamans that we work with, and they can help prepare you and integrate from spiritual experiences, namely psychedelics, but it doesn't have to be. And then we're also, as part of that, training people to become psychedelic coaches. So if you want to get an official accreditation that allows you to see clients, again, combining psychology, psychiatry, spirituality, and human optimization, then please do check out the Onaya psychedelic coaching at onaya.io.
Wow, that is fascinating, Simon. I might have to look into that a bit more.
Please.
A final question, Simon. If you were to go back to your younger self many years ago, what's the one, knowing what you know now, should I say, what's the one piece of advice that you'd give young Simon?
Care less about what everyone else thinks. You know what your path is, and as long as you follow that and you're in flow with that, then it will work out better than you can possibly imagine. Don't try and live somebody else's life.
Simon, thank you so much for being a guest on my show.